Terrific. Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending the It's Alive animation techniques that bring to life SPFx and list formatting SharePoint solutions. This is the SPSLive event, and we appreciate you attending today. Of course, to get us started, we want to show some additional appreciation for all the sponsors. We know that these are virtual events, but we also know that there is a cost and time associated, so we really appreciate all these sponsors that are willing to provide some additional support. Can't say that I'm not in love with the TV logo colors. I think that's my favorite. I don't know why, but all right. My name is David Warner. I am a Microsoft MVP, PNP team member, work for Catapult Systems. Big sports fan, as you can see by the photos and the helmets likely behind me. But I'm an even bigger fan of the community, so please don't let this be the only time we collaborate. Don't hesitate to reach out. You've got my Twitter information and my email address there. Things are going to get a little Transylvania-like today. We see the transformation to black and white has already occurred. But of course, I could not do this session without my good friend, Hugo Bernier. Hugo?
Hey everyone, my name is Hugo. I used to be an MVP until the incident, and I'm a member of the Patterns and Practices team and also a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. And like David, I'm always happy to work with the community. Feel free to reach out to me, my Twitter account. Don't use my email so much, but my Twitter, I will do my best to respond to you.
He has been assimilated. Thank you, Hugo. Awesome. All right, let's talk about what the agenda is for today. So we're going to discuss some reasons for animation. There's a lot of ways to accomplish animation, technically speaking, not all of which you want to absolutely use all the time or for just no apparent reason. There are very specific reasons and times upon which you would want to utilize them, but also some awareness you want to have. So we're going to discuss what those reasons for animation are, and then we're going to go through the hat trick or the spectrum of opportunities for you to be able to create and utilize these techniques. So the first is the no code. That's a familiar term to us all. We're going to look to see how we can use almost nothing to provide some animation techniques. Then we're going to talk about low code, and low code is going to be easy use. And then what do you have after no code and low code? Well, you're going to have mo code, right? We want some more code opportunities if you're a big dev fan and you want to get involved there. So we're going to ultimately show you how you're going to bring your creations to life. We absolutely like to have fun. If you're familiar with the classic Young Frankenstein, Hugo and I are not afraid to make fun of ourselves, and we enjoy the opportunity to use some humor. So we'll be using that all throughout today. But let's talk about what it is that we're here to do today. And that is the typical, can you make SharePoint not look like SharePoint? This was always a request back in the day of classic SharePoint. Although it's not quite as used now because the modern experience does look good. It looks much better. It's responsive out of the box. The challenges are, though, that we have a very defined box, right? We're not able to override everything in the landscape of our SharePoint sites. But we do want to add flavor. We want to add individuality. We want to add some dynamic personality. We want it to be engaging, and we want it to be engaging based on how our users are going to interact with it. Does that mean that we have to write everything from scratch in SPFX, or that some of the things available to us in Classic were no longer available to us in Modern? Not at all. You just have to understand the landscape. And so what we're going to start by doing is discussing who can use the techniques that we're going to who can use the techniques that we're going to show you today. Now, these are power users, non-developers. These are UI designers and SPFX developers. So really, if you have any experience or involvement with SharePoint, there's going to hopefully be value for you to take away from this presentation today, whether you're going to learn about some techniques that are available for you to show your developers, or whether you're a developer, or whether you're just a power user who wants to be able to not feel like you have to have a degree in development, but you want to be able to add some visual appeal, some dynamic experience, and really increase the adoption and engagement by your users. So the big question is how animations enhance user experience. I'm going to hand that over to Hugo to walk us through that.
Awesome. Thank you, David. So animations, or more importantly, micro animations, are tiny little animations that you can use to enhance the user experience. And they're starting to be more and more prevalent throughout organizations or applications, I should say. Even Windows 11, if you've installed Windows 11, a lot of the icons, a lot of the buttons are starting to have micro animation as a way to keep the users engaged. So let's talk about a real life scenario of what I like to call a micro animation. Let's take the example of the countdown web part, right? It's available in SharePoint. It counts down to a tight deadline. And now they could have just displayed the date and time and be done with it and say this is when this is going to be done. But by counting down, it brings your attention to it. It conveys the deadlines approaching, and it brings a sense of urgency to the importance of the event. And you might say it's not even an animation, but it's bringing your eye to look at it, and that's the whole point of micro animations. And that's what we're trying to do with micro animations. We're trying to convey information in a subtle way without being distracting. So let's move on to some examples. So micro animations are trying to solve a problem. So one of the problems is that the user is saying, hey, I want to know when an action is done. So you would use a micro animation to illustrate that an action has been processed. So when I click on a button, like in this case, a menu or hamburger menu, it shows you the little close icon and it switches back and forth. It's a cute little subtle animation, but doing that again conveys that the action did something. The other problem that I might want to solve is I want to know that an action is actually in progress. Not that it's been processed, but it's actually happening, that it's not frozen or stuck somewhere. So the example here is a little rocket that gets launched when you start an action, right? No, they could have just done a little spinny thing, and we'll talk about the use of spinny things. But these little opportunities to delight your users can make all the difference. Another problem that we're trying to solve is I want to understand, okay, so I want to understand that the action I did was captured. I want to understand that something has started, but I also want to understand how long this thing will take. So visualizing here in this case by showing kind of the seasons and how long it'll take and things like that is a good way to illustrate this is how long the action will take. Now, so far, all these micro animations are really related to kind of letting you know that your click did something, but sometimes you want to bring the user's attention on crucial things. So for example, the problem we're trying to solve is I want to see the key things first, right? So in this case, we're boiling it down to information that is the most important, right? In this case, it's a little weather thingy. So what's the most important here? Is it going to be sunny, rainy, cloudy, snowy, sneezy, whatever the season is? And it just shows that, right? All the extra stuff, all the extra details is there, but it's not capturing your attention. It's a concept of progressive disclosure. We progressively disclose or show more information as the user indicates that they want to see more stuff. That way we're not overloading the user with too much information. And then another way that we can use micro animations is by making interactions feel more natural, right? So, if you think about the user interface and using a mouse and a keyboard, it's not very natural, right? I'm moving a mouse on this direction, up like forward and backward, but on the screen it goes up and down like this. There's always this weird disconnect between the device I'm using and the impact that it has. But if we can actually create an interaction that feels more natural. So for example, you see how when we're mousing around on that list, all the items on that list shift a little bit as if they were on a conveyor belt, and we're just moving the conveyor belt really quickly, and it just makes things wobble. By making things feel more natural, the users feel that the application is more instinctive because it feels like and it works like the things in real life, and therefore it's more user-friendly. Excuse me. And then you want to make things more exciting, right? The problem is sometimes your screen, your page is boring. Sometimes you just want to create an incentive for people to do the right thing. Let's say you have a task that you need your users to do frequently, but you know they just don't want to do it because it's painful and it's annoying and it's boring. By adding a little bit of animation, you can introduce delight and make people do things that they don't want to do. I mean, there's a reason why things like Angry Birds and Candy Crush were so popular. Although they're a huge waste of time, at least for me, they were a huge waste of time, and they still are. They delight the users because it makes them want to continue things because there's cute things happening, right? Cute sounds, cute candies and things like that. And you can actually do the same thing with your apps with micro animations. And that's what we're going to be talking about. But there are some rules. There are some guidelines. Let's talk about those guidelines. The first thing is you need to consider how often the user will see the animation, right? The first time they see animation, they think it's cute, they think it's funny, it delights them. If they see the same animation over and over again, eventually that delight will become annoyance, right? So don't overuse the animation if possible. And we'll show you an example later in our demo where we overuse an animation because we wanted to make sure you see it in the demo, but it's probably not the best thing to do, and you'll see why. Now, the duration of an animation is also kind of important. If it's too fast, people might not notice it. And if it's too slow, people might not notice it as well. So there's a sweet spot. Let's talk about that sweet spot, right? So this is timeline between 0 and 1 second. And it turns out that there's an optimal speed for creating those animations. The one thing is anything below 100 milliseconds is something that would be considered instant. So don't bother doing an animation less than that. Your users are not even going to notice it's an animation. Now, it takes about 150 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds for users to even comprehend or understand that there's an animation happening. And again, we have to understand that there's different people that have different cognitive abilities. So if you make everything 150 milliseconds, your users might not all notice it. Only the people that are a bit more attuned or, that are paying more attention. But if you make your animation between about 200 to 500 milliseconds, you're actually making sure that your users will notice it. So that's kind of like the sweet spot, the animation sweet spot. Do your animations between 200 and 500 milliseconds. And if you learn nothing else from today's session, is that magical number, right? How long to make your animations. Now, the speed of the animation can also affect the performance. A slower animation might lead the users to think that the application is slow. And animations can actually be used to hide delays, and by keeping the users engaged, the perceived performance increases. Loading animations will keep the user occupied, also with visual feedback. We talked about that before. Like they want to see that there's something happening. As a result, the users will actually perceive it as a shorter wait time. The number of cycles that an animation uses can also increase the perceived speed. So there's apps like Facebook, for those of us who are still using Facebook. It's got like a concept of a skeleton content that it loads, right? So it loads what seems to be the content, but it's actually just gray rectangles. But the way it does it, you don't really notice it. It just makes it look like the app is responsive, even though it's just showing you gray rectangles, and then it puts in the content for you. And before you realize that it was gray rectangles, you just think that the application was super responsive. So that's a better solution than just using a boring spinner. In fact, Viget, they did a study and they found that people would actually be willing to wait longer for like a custom branded loading animation over like a generic, spinner, for example. And then we have to consider things like accessibility. People can get sick from animations. That's why in since iOS 7, I believe, you've had the option to turn off the parallax effect on the phone because people would get sick, right? Because we get sick when our impact on our perception of the world is different than what we expect. We tend to think that we've been poisoned or something, and that's why we have a tendency to get sick. So animations should never be automatic. They should be triggered either by mousing over, by clicking on something. Oh, did we lose my screen? I'm not sharing anymore.
I still see it.
Okay.
I see the accessibility slide.
Okay, cool. You don't want to catch your users off guard, right? And so just don't do a giant autoplay animation. Now, if you want to highlight something, like bring in intention to, there's a tutorial that's available for you. So let me show you a little teaching bubble. That's fine. I'm just talking about like a giant animation that will like trigger people. One of the tricks, by the way, is when you're looking at accessibility, you know, if you have motion sickness, you can go in your browser and you can actually say that you prefer less animations, and you can do that without loading any adding any additional code in your HTML. So, for example, here's an animation that is pulsating 1 second infinite animation. That would be super annoying for anybody, but someone who's actually got accessibility issues with motion sickness might actually make them feel sick. But with just using media query in your CSS, you can actually say this person prefers reduced motion, and then you can actually create a different animation. Maybe it's a single time animation where we dissolve instead of, you know, do a pulsating infinite thing. And why are we talking about things like that? Doesn't it seem like it would make sense? Well, there are websites. This is an actual real website. I love this website, by the way. It always gets better and better. But linkscar.com, actually, they just have so much animation going on, so many things that it just becomes impossible. And you can probably not see it as well because of the frames per second sharing by teams, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. So if you're ever looking at a good example of what not to do for your users, go to linkscar.com. Now, I'm not saying Linkscar is bad. It's got its own kind of appeal that it's just so overly out there that it's kind of fun to watch. But you don't want to make your users suffer through that in real life. All right, so let's just use an example. This is a web part that I created a long time ago. It allows people to take a picture and submit it for photo ID. And it uses Azure Cognitive Services to analyze the picture to make sure that it's an appropriate picture, that I didn't, send inappropriate, risque adult images, that I, didn't send a picture of my pets instead, that I'm not sending pictures of my kids, I'm not sending images of hand-drawn images of me or things like that. Instead of having someone manually reviewing these, we can use Cognitive Services to analyze this. Now, it calls an API. So if I just kind of show you what happens when I use the web part, I'll just play this here. It'll play. We should be seeing that happen anytime now. There you go. So when you click on it, it starts analyzing, right? And it's analyzing, and then it says, here's your age. By the way, that is not my age, but I'll take it. Now, let's look at what happens if I add a little bit of animation and a better looking person to analyze as well. So now if I take David's image and I submit it, and I add the little animation here, the little green thing that's moving across, it actually estimates that David is like 28. How do you do that, David?
It's the hair. It's the hair.
Yes. Now,
makes me look younger.
Animation and the previous animation, or this delay and the previous delay, were exactly the same thing. But you might have noticed, because the image went down one time, or the line went down one time, it might have felt sluggish, even though it might the delay might have felt shorter. Let's look at what happens when I create a repeat animation. Not this one. This one here. Let's use me again, and let's use a repeat animation instead. So click. Now it's a faster animation. It goes a few times. I add a bit of facial detection because I already got that information in my call, and I'm displaying this. Now, this might have seemed faster for you, but they were all exactly the same weight because they all went to Azure services and made the calls. But the animation made it feel faster. And that's really what we're trying to do. So let's talk about some of the techniques that we use to do this kind of stuff.
And the first one, yeah, absolutely. And the first one we're going to start with is no-code techniques. Now, this may seem a little bit like a lie, right? Because when you think about what exactly no code means, and that box needs to get rid of, there we go. What exactly is no code, right? Well, is it possible to make any kind of modification without actually writing or injecting any kind of code, whether it be simplistic code, CSS, or something similar? Well, no, it's not. There's absolutely going to be some degree of code, but what we want you to take away in this section is that even if you're not comfortable, even if you don't like, even if you're not familiar or experienced with writing code, you can absolutely copy and paste. You can Control-C, Control-V, Command-C, Command-V, depending on the OS you're on, and you can take existing samples and paste them into the SharePoint experience, which is what we're going to show you to do today. So again, if you are not a lover of code and you're like, it's not my area, so does that mean I got to check out and eject now? Nope, not at all. Stay tuned, buckle up, stay in your seat, and we will give you a ton of resources where all you need to do is Control-C, Control-V, and you can take advantage of them. So let's talk about what we're going to do. Let's take a look at that demo. I'm going to bring up a SharePoint list. What we have here is a SharePoint list of community contributors, and we see this is just a fairly standard collection. We've got some pictures, we've got our job title and name, stuff like that, right? Now with list formatting, we can make it look really cool. So I'm going to go over to what we call a photo view. And now what we have is a little bit of a Polaroid-like experience. And this is great, but out of the box with list formatting, we have to rely on inline CSS to be able to accomplish anything. And in the small example that Hugo had showed you, obviously things like animations and dynamic effects based on the user's interaction requires what's called pseudo attributes. And so you need to be able to have additional CSS. So in and of itself, this is a great start, but it's still pretty flat. There's not a lot we can do with it just within the list to make it completely interactive. But remember, in the list web part, you can actually inherit the list formatting experience. So what we've done on this page is we've taken the list web part, and if I edit it, we see those properties right here, right? And we're pointing at the same experiences we were using. Community contributors, we've got a couple of views. In this case, we're using PNP Demo Enhanced Styles 2. And what it's done is it's just put it on the page, essentially inheriting exactly what we got from the list formatting. So how are we going to be able to add additional CSS to provide some animation experience for our users that will increase the engagement and enjoyment of interacting with this page? Well, there is a web part that you can take advantage of. And this is a web part that has been brought out by the Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices community. And if you're not familiar with that, don't worry, we'll provide you more links later. It is a free web part called the List Formatting Enhanced web part. Now, what it does is it allows you to inject CSS directly on the page. Now, if you're familiar with the new model for Microsoft 365 and the modern experience, injection can be kind of a dirty word because it makes it sound like you're going to override things on the page that you shouldn't be taking advantage of or overwriting because Microsoft can change it and we don't own that space. In the case of Microsoft list formatting, though, we're able to create class names, CSS class names that belong to us, belong to our list formatting definition. Microsoft won't change those. So while it is within the scope of a page, using an out-of-the-box web part, you are controlling the content of that web part. So when you, in your list formatting definition, create a custom class name, you are able to hook into that class and take advantage of it. Now, does this web part allow you to do more devious things? Yes. You want to be a hero, not a villain. So we provide you a warning. If you were to use this web part, you inject it on the page, and it's going to allow you to include CSS that will override certain functionality or experience or styling directly with items on this page. And you use it to override things you don't own or that do not belong to you, then you are going to risk some very specific bad things. Loss of styles could be applied, broken styles. People are going to call SharePoint broken. You're going to be in tears. You're going to have nightmares. There'll be blue screens of death. The world will be over. Please be a hero, not a villain. As Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, the Spider-Man principle, as we call it, said, great power comes great responsibility. So you want to use this and be the hero of the story, not the villain. But once you've accepted those terms and you understand that it is a powerful control, you're able to add, as we can see right here, custom styles directly to our page. And when we do that, it's going to bring out a little enhanced list formatting panel where we're able to define, as we see here, some custom CSS. Now, this box is very, very powerful. You can write directly in line, similar to how we do with list formatting definitions, or you could click the little full screen editor and it opens up. Now, what I'm going to do in this case is I'm just simply going to copy and paste some CSS. Now, this is just CSS that we've created, and again, there's no smoke and mirrors here. I'm just going to show it to you. 50-something lines of CSS, very simple, and that's the concept for this no-code section. Is we're just taking CSS that we're copying and pasting. So I'm going to take that. I'm going to paste it in. And we see down here, we're looking at that hover attribute, right? So now we're essentially saying with this CSS, we want something specific to happen when we hover over one of these elements, right? In this case, it's the div Polaroids elements. And I'm going to click save. And you'll notice immediately, perhaps, some things have happened. That is that there's a little askew to the Polaroids, right? So now they look a little more natural sitting on the page because that's something that is unique to the real world, right? You put Polaroids on the page on a table or something like that, very likely or unlikely they're just going to sit perfectly. So now we've added a little bit of an askew to them to make it look more natural. But you're saying, hey, well, you highlighted that hover state. What happens there? So now watch what happens when I hover over it with my cursor. It expands the focus and the prominence of the individual contributor or Polaroid, right? So now as I hover over all these people, when I am choosing to hover over them, I see a little bit of a change. It's changing the zoom and bringing them to focus a little bit more from my eye. Now, but wait, there's more. There's more that we can do here. So let's go back to our custom styles, and I'm going to delete, and I'm going to add another collection of CSS here. Now, when I do that, you'll notice a couple of additional things have changed. One that's very apparent, right? It's gone to black and white. We've taken on the film noir effective young Frankenstein, made it spooky, if you will, and it's now black and white. You also may notice, though, the font has changed because what did we used to do with Polaroids, and now it's, of course, come back into popularity with the kids and the Polaroids, is you'd get the Polaroid out and you'd write on it. You write the name, maybe the location, the time, the date, whatever the case may be. So now in this case, what we've done is we've utilized a custom font that looks like handwriting. Now, you don't want to override, again, fonts everywhere or elsewhere on the page that you don't own, but in this case, we own the actual CSS for this list formatting definition. So we've added a little more realism to the Polaroid by making it look like the names were handwritten. A great little addition. But what was the reason for turning it black and white? Well, now look what happens when we hover over it. We're able to use some animated color shifting to now bring the focus even more to our particular users, right, that we're choosing to hover over. And now it just makes it a little bit more enjoyable to now look at them. And of course, it brings prominence to the action we're making. But wait, there's more. We can do even more with just CSS. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to change my custom styles. I'm going to paste in some new ones, and you can already see right away we're looking at some animation right there because we've got keyframes. So if you're familiar with CSS animation, you know it uses keyframing. If you're not, don't worry. Again, copy and paste here. We're going to provide you some assets, and you'll see what's happened is it's added a little heart down by the name right there to each animation. And by using just CSS, when I now hover over it, we still see the little color shift. But when I hover over the heart, look what happens. I see a shift. I'm using an animated sprite to actually create a little more interaction with the heart when I hover over it. Of course, when I click on it, there's no effect here because we're just using a CSS, but we could absolutely connect that up to some other flow or some other Power Automate connector or something like that that allows us to kick off maybe a link back to the list that changes a property and says, hey, watch or favorite or something like that. And so there's a lot of capabilities that we can take advantage of right there. All right, so that's no code. We again, no code is meaning we're going to copy and paste. But what were the resources that we covered today in this particular section? Well, list formatting samples. So this is where we talked about you're able to take advantage of some resources. That one right there, that URL is going to give you access to a whole bunch of web list formatting definitions that are going to enhance the look and feel. And then to inject CSS to override them, you use this particular URL right there. You go to aka.ms SPFx web parts and you look for the list formatting enhancer web part. Now that will have to be installed, and so you need to get with your tenant administrators to install it, but it is a real lightweight one. It's not connecting to Graph or doesn't require any huge permissions to be set. All right, now let's dive into the low code technique. So what exactly is low code? Well, it's interactive user-driven trigger. So think of things like clicking, right? That is a user-driven trigger, not just hovering, that's a trigger too, but in this case, we're talking about a little bit more verbose triggers that can be tracked using things like JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Now, do you have to be an SPFx developer here? No, not at all. We're going to give you some tools and access to resources where as long as you're comfortable within the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript space, you can absolutely implement some of the things that we're going to show you here today in this low code section. So let's take a look at the demo. Let's go back to our list and let's go over to another page where we have low code techniques set up. Now, I'm going to throw this into edit view because I want to show you what it is that we're using as a tool. The React Content Query web part is again, community provided web part that is similar to the classic Content Query web part. We may all remember that in the classic world. It was actually quite powerful. It would allow you to pull information from a list or a library, and then you had to use XSL to actually adjust how your content looked. XSL, people loved it, they hated it. I hated it at first. I learned to love it because you had to get to know it. It was confusing though. I remember interviewing someone and saying, hey, how familiar are you with XSL? They said, I use Microsoft Excel all the time. Understandably so, it's a confusing language and it was not as powerful as something like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So there was less implementation of it. I remember using it to write data dash attributes, and then I would use JavaScript to take those, much similar to how SPFx does today. But now in the modern world, we don't have to deal with that. We have the ability to write what's called Handlebar Templates, which is, don't let that intimidate you, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So much like the classic CQWP, we have the ability to source, right? So now, if you look right here, we're actually able to go cross-site collection, which is awesome. That was not available in Classic. And we define the web and the list that we're wanting to pull the data out of. We have the ability to sort and filter, right? Much like the Classic version as well. And then we decide what we want to have included, what columns we want to be able to pull back. In this case, we're using ID and things like picture and title, right? So we're pulling all that data back. And then if we look down here at the bottom, specifically, there is a template section, right? And what that does is based on the data we're pulling back, we're now able to control the actual template. Now, the template is nothing more than HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if I open up the default template that the web part creates, it just is going to make a very basic looking one, just picture, title, ID. It's going to look much like an Excel table, essentially. But you can see it's written here in just CSS and HTML. But you can override that, right? And so that's what we've done here is I've provided a template URL to an HTML file that is located directly in our tenant. So you can see there, it's nothing more than simple HTML. And then additionally, we can utilize external scripts, which in this case, we're using jQuery. a little antiquated of a library, but it's very popular, very easy to use, and folks still use it pretty heavily in situations like this. It makes sense. And then we've got a custom JavaScript file right there that we're using to control some of the things that we want to do. So what we're doing, in effect, is we're just using those technologies, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, to be able to display the information that we want using familiar templating programs and technologies and codes such as JavaScript. What does it give us? Well, in the end, it gives us very similar to what we saw in the experience with the no code. But now, as I hover over this, we see we still get that. That's great. Okay, it's bringing it to the forefront. It's changing the color. And I still get that sprite with the heart. But now, when I click on the heart, look what happens. I'm able to change the state using JavaScript, and I'm using animation to make that heart look like it's beating. Now, I can do that on each one of these. And Hugo mentioned earlier, we would never want to just have things go infinite. And we're doing that here just to prove a point so that it shows up okay in the demo, you don't miss it. But it also proves another point in that, look how distracting that is. My eyes are shooting all over the screen because I'm seeing all these hearts beating in different unison, not in unison, in different sections, right? And it's super distracting. But the point is that we could actually make that happen the first time we click on it. So we can make it beat a couple times, connect out to a Power Automate workflow, and accomplish something again back in the list if we wanted. But it adds a little bit of experience and user pleasantry to the action that I took. Right now, again, a minor thing, and again, we would never want to actually have that happen continually over and over and over. But it shows you the power of being able to utilize all that is provided to us through the Handlebar template and the content query web part. Now, what if there's additional information that we wanted to include? What if we wanted to show more information about these community contributors? I'm going to go over to my low code 2 page, and just for reference, we're still using the content query web part. Right, we still have the same source here. We still have the same filter and sort. We still have the same template we're able to do, but in this case now we're just using a different template. And what can we do to add additional information? So we still have the ability to hover and see. And in fact, I'm going to republish this just because I don't know if you noticed when it first loads, and I'll reload it a couple of times. You can see that those names come into focus in an animated way as the page loads. It's a nice little pleasant thing. And we see that gets aligned and all that. But if we wanted to overload here, there's not a lot of space on demand or on default for us to include additional information about these community contributors. But again, if we wanted to look at some of those animation techniques we're using here, now we're able to take additional information that was in the list. And when I hover over these individual users, I can see a little bit more information about them. In fact, I can even also have a little call to action. So here in the case of Hugo, I can click on follow on Twitter, open that in a new tab. And of course, I've got them all set to the same thing, but it would take us to the Twitter accounts and allow us to follow them, right? So it's a nice little effect, and it's an opportunity to be able to display more information. Maybe we want to include something about the department they're in, their contact information, something like that. We also can still combine it with everything we've learned so far, right? So I've still got the heart there, and I find out maybe Hugo loves hockey, as I know he does. He doesn't, but I wish he would. And I want to follow him because of that, right? So now I click on it and it persists, and I've got that heartbeat showing up. So a lot of opportunities here to utilize low-code techniques to provide a better experience. In fact, not only are we providing a better interactive experience, we're actually able to increase the content that's being displayed by way of a nice, clean animation as well. So when the page loads, we're not overloading the user with all this information until they have made the decision to hover over an individual user and see more information about them. And a lot of these things can be, a lot of these animations can be gotten from online tools and resources, one of which is called Animista. We'll talk about that in a moment. Hugo's going to show you a demo of that later. So let's go back and look at those resources that we used here. So of course, we use that content query web part. That is also a free tool available at that same URL we gave you earlier. If you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out. It actually now does connect to the graph, which means that you can use Microsoft Graph Toolkits. And again, for those animation techniques, if you're not real strong at CSS and you don't feel like I'm not going to take on all that on my own, don't worry. We've got animated or interactive tools that give you all the code you need. So it takes you back to that no code. So animista.net, Hugo's going to show you a demo of that soon. But with that, we're going to hand it back over to Hugo, who's going to go into the next section, Mo code techniques.
Awesome. Let's talk about Mo code. Can you hear me? It says I'm.
I can't hear you. Yep.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Because it says I'm muted. Awesome. Okay, so we'll talk about some Mo code techniques, and let's just bring things in perspective. When we're talking about Mo code techniques, we're talking about kind of things like actual SPFx development, SharePoint Framework development. We're talking about things like adding advanced animation frameworks, and maybe even like physics-driven animation, right? So let's do some Mo code. And before we do, let's just do this. Before we do, I wanted to highlight some of the things that David's talked about. First of all, I wanted to point out, David, there was kind of a cool, trip down memory lane when you're talking about Polaroids when you were young. When I was young, we had to stay very still when the photographer would take pictures as he put the curtain over his head. Otherwise, the pictures would be blurry. So I wish I could relate to that. But the other thing, too, is you may have noticed some tips and tricks that we talked about earlier in David's animation that we just snuck in. For example, that little blur effect when we were loading the name, that was a way to actually delay getting the information and make the application look more responsive. The other thing that we did is we encouraged discovery, right? Because when you make the applications fun to click around and to mouse over and stuff like that, your users are going to feel like they can discover more, and they'll want to try things out. The thing that's important though in your user experience design, make sure that you include forgiveness, right? The ability for people to explore and without making a huge commitment like, oh, this deleted this person, from the record without asking you whether, or without giving you the ability to either undo or cancel. Those are great and important topics and concepts is the word I was looking for. All right, so we talked about Animista. Animista is animista.net. There's lots of other sites like that, but we like Animista. We use Animista to create this demo, where you can go. There's all sorts of basic animations, entrance animations. You just saw the thing click in, right? We got some attention, like an animation that I would never want to do, but like a wobble, a shake. You have these concepts that are available to you, and then the cool thing about this is I'll pick something that's maybe not as annoying. So here, this little thing here that's just did this little animation. You can configure it the way you want. So what kind of object you want to see, how long, what direction, the fill and everything, and then you can actually go here, and it'll give you the code to copy. Right, and it'll even minify it for you if you want to make it optimized, for your browser. So that's a great way to actually get super quick animations. And then again, if I go back, there's different types of animations of the same animation. You grab that, you put that in your CSS, and you're super happy. Now, however, and this thing doesn't want to go away, so I apologize in advance. But
the presentation thing,
yeah.
It's actually not showing for me, so it must be a smart Teams thing.
That's good. Awesome. So on one of the libraries that we like to use is GreenSock. Now, GreenSock is a library that you can get for free. There's also a version where you pay for. We're not sponsored by GreenSock, or we're not getting any money for mentioning them. We just happen to really, really like them. I'm sure there's tons of other libraries out there that you can use to do advanced animations. But the cool thing with GreenSock is there's lots of cool animations, and maybe I can just show some examples here of some cool things that you can do with it. All sorts of 3D, SVG, stuff like that. All these things we could have built into our solution. We wanted something that was easy to demonstrate and could potentially have at least a pretend business scenario. So let's pretend we had our list of people that we're talking about, right? We talked about community members. Maybe they're not community members. Maybe they're shift workers, and we're trying to build a shift, or maybe we're trying to create a kind of a call chain, right? When this person's supposed to answer a call, they don't answer, the next person answers, the next person answers. And maybe I want to create a drag and drop interface where I can move these people in the order that I want. Or I don't know, some other scenario, insert your own scenario here where you have a need to drag and drop some things. I saw this green sock sample called Sortable Grid using Draggable. And it's basically consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you say I'm going to use a square or fixed style size and I move stuff around, I can just drag and drop things. It's pretty easy, right? Well, guess what? I took pretty much the exact same code that's in here. And I didn't do it as an SPFx solution. I actually just did it using the same technique. But again, I used the third-party library to create this web part here. So let me just refresh to show you that I'm not cheating here. So same web part that looks probably familiar, but see now I have this giant Mickey Mouse glove that looks like I have the ability to drag and drop. So imagine now that I wanted to say, okay, I'm creating a call structure here where Bo's the first person that should answer the calls, then David, and then Alex, and then April, and I'm the last person you should get to talk to ever. Now imagine if, in this case, the demo doesn't do this, but imagine if we were writing back to a library and do a post back with the sort order or things like that. Imagine how cool that would be. Now, we use the exact same technique that David talked about today, where if I go to the web part and I kind of edit, we use the content query web part. Again, I could have built this in an SPFx web part, but we wanted to make, even though it's a mo-code solution, we wanted to make it super easy for someone to just take this web part and embed it in their site to play with it. But what we do is we kind of call the template URL that has the same HTML and CSS that we talked about earlier, but I've added additional script where I now call jQuery, I call greensock animation package, and I call the greensock draggable. And then I have my own custom code that basically combines the greensock code and the code that David did to make it look like this. So it's a very, very simple concept, but it does the trick. Now, again, I could have embedded this in a SharePoint web part. I could have added all sorts of 3D animation techniques and things like that. The one thing I want to make clear here is that in today's demo, we used a lot of gratuitous animation, maybe even potentially cheesy animations to illustrate the concept. You have to apply your own kind of business rules for this. Like, you're probably not going to want to show a list of community members. You're probably going to want to do something that's more relevant to your business. But again, we were trying to create a scenario that illustrated the concepts without being boring, you know, because, and we obviously wanted something that everyone could potentially identify to. All right, so let's go back to our slides. There you go. So some of the resources that we used for this thing was we used the PnP modern content query web part, which is the same one that David used. We also used greensock for our animation. Again, you could have used any kind of third-party library you wanted to. In terms of all the things that we did today, right? So we've got our list formatting web part, or sorry, our list formatting, the enhanced list formatting web part, the content query web part. We use Animista to create the animations, and then greensock to add a third-party library to make advanced animations as well. With that in mind, we would like to thank you for listening to us as we're showing you all sorts of ways that you can use animations and micro animations to bring your applications to life and increase the customer satisfaction or user satisfaction of your applications, you know, and make applications feel snappier and more interactive. even though they might not be any faster or anything. As David said, with great power comes great responsibility. Make sure you use these powers for good, not evil, right? You can do some really cool stuff. You can make your users fall in love with your applications. Do that, and it's going to be awesome. All the resources that we use are available. You can reach out to us if you'd like to have the code and things like that. We're always happy to help. With that, my name is Hugo. I can be reached on Twitter, and my blog is tahoninjas.blog. And David?
My name is David, or Igor, I will go by sometimes. At David Warner II, that is what those letters are, not LL, David Warner II, and warner.digital is my blog. Again, just echoing what Hugo said, we're huge fans of the community. And if you, by the way, are at all curious about getting involved as a contributor to the community, we also run an initiative or program called Sharing is Caring. And this is under the Patterns and Practices umbrella. If you would like to start learning how you can contribute more, in fact, some of the examples that we showed you here today are absolutely compatible with contribution opportunities, and Hugo's bringing it up. We will walk you through how to contribute to the community hands-on guidance in a collaborative way. It's a live session, multiple sessions actually. They are inclusive, safe space opportunities. We don't record them, so there's no worry of, oh my goodness, should I ask this question? Should I already know the answer to this question? I know we've all done it. I do it every day, so don't feel bad. It's not going to get recorded. They are collaborative, inclusive opportunities to work with others in the community, learn and meet others in the community. So we encourage you to sign up, aka.ms/sharing-is-caring. And we also have a lot of AMA. So if you're curious about some of the other technologies that you may see on your screen, like Power Platform samples or list formatting specifically, is coming up on October 5th with the one and only Chris Kent, the Warrior Horse Whisperer. We encourage you to sign up and learn a little bit more about that. So take advantage of it. We are here to provide any assistance, whether you want to get started using or contributing back. And again, we just thank you for attending the session today.